Hey, AP students, we are here with our second installment of some multiple choice questions that we're going to solve together here. You're being reminded that if you have not gone through and done that second section, so here's the name of it, 2017 International MCQ 21 to 40, you want to do that first, okay? This is just kind of a way that I'm trying to explain some questions. I'm going to go through, obviously, the 20 of them. You don't necessarily have to watch the entire video. You can fast forward. You'll see that as I go through these, you'll see what the question number is and stuff like that. So anyway, hopefully you get something out of this. I know it's not a perfect way to talk about what you should do, and maybe your strategies are a little bit different than mine. But again, reminded that hopefully you're going to be able to, even if it adds 1 point to your eventual AP test, we'll take it. So anyway, we're going to get rolling here. Again, bear with me if I try to do this in one take. So if I screw something up, kind of forgive me in advance, and hopefully you're able to get something. Okay, so on our first one here, we are talking about a bank having no excess reserves, and that in this case, the Federal Reserve is going to decrease the reserve ratio. Okay, the required reserve ratio. Sorry. So whatever that percentage was, 10% to let's say 5%, right? The bank now has more money to loan out. Okay. Now here's the tricky part. They're going to trick you. They're going to say, okay, total reserves. Well, the total reserves don't change, right? Our required reserves are what goes down. Our bank has more required reserves. We're going to increase our money supply, okay? And we also increase our money multiplier. Remember, our money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So if we change it from over 20%, let's say, so 0.20, that would be 5. If we lower that reserve requirement to 0.1, it's 10. It changes that money multiplier, something that you kind of got to memorize, and hopefully you're able to remember when you get to that particular point. Okay, moving on to the next one here. If our consumer price index increases from 200 to 240 in a 1 year period, what does that do to our inflation rate? What is our inflation rate? Remember, to figure out percentages, it's the change divided by the original, okay, times 100. In this case, it's the 40 over 200 equals 20%. All right, be able to figure that out. You should be good to go. All right, number 3, a fully anticipated expansion of the money supply. Okay, so if we increase our money supply, remember what's going to happen, probably most importantly, is that we're going to shift our supply money over here. Our interest rates are going to go down. All right, and it's asking us what's going to happen to, all right, our GDP and eventually the price level. And it also mentions real wage in there too. But we should remember that our price level is going to represent our real wage as well. Okay, so we've got our price level, we've got our real GDP. Kind of brings me to a point here where also remember that anytime you kind of see these, answers kind of presented in these axes types of things, right? And you can kind of try to draw these graphs as best as you can as you move forward. It's going to help you kind of keep things straight. So we have a lower interest rate, which means we're going to increase our aggregate demand. Okay, so we know that our price level is going to increase, our output is going to increase, and we're going to throw in there too, just in case, our unemployment is also going to decrease. Okay, so let's see what our answers match up with. Price level and nominal GDP and the price level. Now, the reason why we don't say the real GDP, okay, which is tricky, the reason why we can't say that is because we don't know the absolute inflation rate. Okay, we don't know what that is, so we can't say our real GDP is going to increase. If inflation was super, super high, right, we don't necessarily know if increasing our nominal GDP is going to go up. So we don't have, and this is kind of tricky, we didn't cover it too much, but we don't have that real interest rate, okay, of to be able to figure out our real GDP, even though our real GDP, our output down here is labeled as such. A little bit of a tricky one, a little bit of a higher level thing that you've got to remember when you get to that. All right, which following policy actions are going to promote long-run growth? This is going to be something that has to increase our amount of resources. Okay, so whether that is land, whether that is human capability, whether that is like talent, or whether that is like available capital. Okay, so again, what can we produce? Kind of with along with our production possibilities curve. How do we make that production possibilities curve bow out further? Decrease in investment tax credit? Nope. That just decreases the cost of supplying stuff, right? Decreasing money supply, nope, that's affecting our demand. Increasing unemployment compensation, that's going to affect demand. Increasing tax rates, that's going to decrease our demand on savings income. That's going to take away our ability to spend money. Increasing investment in human capital goes back to one of those resources we mentioned to start. Again, if you want to look that up, look up the long run aggregate supply stuff. What's going to increase the current account surplus in Japan's balance of payment accounts? Okay, so this is one thing that we talked actually very little about, and it starts to kind of confuse you if you don't keep things straight. So if I get one of these current account situations, I'm always going to set this graph up where, again, I'm going to have Japan and I have country X. All right, let's call it actually country Y. All right, we've got our current account. It's our imports and exports. Okay, so I'm going to label those with an X and an M. And down here is going to be our financial account, financial. Okay, and those are our X's and I's. And I can fill this in for country Y too, right? And do the same thing. And remember, our inequality signs here in a second are going to flip as we kind of fill this out. All right. Now, in this case, it says that Japan has an account surplus. Okay, so that means that we are exporting more than we are importing. It means we flip it over here, we keep this inequality the same, X's and O's together. Now, do I need this to be able to answer the question? I really don't necessarily need it. Okay, what I need to know is what consists of these current account situations. Okay, so I'm trying to increase the current account surplus. So that means I need to export more. Okay, so exporting more of a good in this particular case is going to be the best example of Japan selling coffee to Canada. That's a physical good or service, right? Investor, that's your financial stuff. Stocks, financial. Piece of equipment in Germany, that's like property in a different country, right? That's financial also. And we also have another investment within a foreign country as well. So we only have one capital account here. The other way they could have tricked you is they could have said, like, if Canada sells coffee to Japan, well, that would be opposite, right? That would be a Japanese import. That would be the opposite of what we're trying to show. All right, so for number 6 here, we're talking about two different countries. They have identical resources, and we're talking about a free trade system. All right. Which of the following has to be true if, in this case, Albania exports electronics? Well, to export something, that means I have to produce it. And if you remember from our first unit, talking about opportunity cost and the idea of specialization, right? If I can figure out, alrighty, that Albania is exporting, we're going to assume that they have specialization, a lower opportunity cost to produce electronics than Batania. Okay, and obviously Batania, we're going to flip. They have a lower opportunity cost of producing apparel in this particular case. Okay, so we call that lower opportunity cost the comparative advantage. It doesn't necessarily tell us who has the absolute advantage. We don't need to know that for this question. Remember, absolute advantage just says I can produce more of this, period. Okay, comparative, I've got to say, what am I giving up in terms of producing a certain product? Okay, so we know that since Albania is exporting, they've got to produce electronics. To produce that electronics, Albania has the comparative advantage in producing electronics. And they do kind of flip this to you here. I almost got caught right? They mention Alphania second down here. It does also say Britannia has a comparative advantage in producing apparel. That we mentioned, they kind of flip it. Okay, so they make you read it real close. That's just kind of a teaching point here as you get better at these. A little bit of a pain in the butt. However, if you get good at it and be able to take your time, you're going to be able to answer these questions with no problem. Okay. All right. Number 7, it's asking us um, what demand pull inflation is going to look like. So we have in demand pull inflation, don't overthink it. Demand has to cause inflation. Well, if our demand goes this way, all right, intersecting with the short run aggregate supply or whatever we want to intersect it with here, our demand goes this way, inflation goes down, right? So what's causing demand pull inflation? Well, we have to cause the demand to increase, right? And if we look at our questions down here, is caused by movement from what? Okay, well, supply, that's going to be, if supply is going to cause inflation, that's cost push. Okay, that's cost push. So if we're going to increase our demand, it's got to be A1 to A2, or I'm sorry, AD1 in this case, to AD2, moving to the right. All right. Which after you see it, it should be pretty obvious. Y1 to YF, that's not our inflation line. That's where our equilibrium output goes to, but it's not our inflation line. So don't confuse yourself. Don't outthink what they're trying to ask you to do. All right, a decrease in taxes is going to do what? We're trying to tie in here the result of some type of public policy, right? Government policy. So we got short run aggregate supply, we got aggregate demand, price level, output. Okay, so now we have a decrease in taxes. That means we have more money. We're going to do this, right? Increase our demand. So what happens? Well, our GDP goes up, our price level goes up. We know that those two things are going to happen. Now, we don't have our real GDP again. Okay, we don't necessarily have that because we don't know what the inflation rate is. If our GDP goes up by 2% and inflation goes up by 3%, we don't have a real GDP increase. If our GDP goes up by 2% and our inflation goes up by 1%, well, now we do have real GDP, but we don't have that information. We can only say nominal GDP. They make this one a little bit easier than the previous number 6 that we talked about. I think it was number 6, where we talked about where it was a comparison between nominal and real. All right, what's going to cause an increase in the real equilibrium interest rate? Well, again, let's just practice drawing these graphs. All right, this graph's simple. We got the demand, we got the supply, we got the interest rate, we got probably our loanable funds here. If you use the money supply, that works too. All right, we've got our quantity. So what do we got to have happen? Well, we've got to have interest rate go up. We've got two options to do that. We can decrease our supply or we can increase our demand. Okay, so let's see what we have to be able to make our interest rate go up. We've got increase in demand is A, that's pretty obvious. Increase in saving, okay, remember, we are the savers. We are the savers in for banks. If we increase in savings, that means banks have a higher supply of money to loan out, right? Well, that's going to lower our interest rate. So we know that that's not the case. Government budget surplus. Remember, a government surplus means they have to borrow less. That's going to decrease our demand. Okay, as we're kind of walking ourselves through this, I would always try to draw this stuff on a graph as you go. You can check your work as you're doing it. Decrease in budget deficit. That means they have to borrow less money still, same concept. All right. And purchase of government bonds by the central bank. Purchase of government bonds by the central bank. And I know this is the loanable funds graph, but buying bonds increases our supply. That's going to lower it also. So we've only got one option there with option A. All right, long run economic growth. We've got to become more efficient, right? We've kind of mentioned this already a couple questions ago. So we've got to do something to either increase our available resources, population, human efficiency, technology to get resources out of the ground, more land, whatever that might be. Well, taxes aren't going to do it. Consumption spending isn't going to do it, right? We're just consuming what's already been produced. Increasing funding for research, making people, making machines faster, getting more production with less inputs. That's our answer. Decreasing funding for law enforcement, nope. Uh, Harvesting all the resources, that's just harvesting resources that are already available. Pretty simple concept, you just got to remember it. All right, foreign exchange market, the exchange rate's defined as the price of one currency compared to another. They try to trick you that say, oh, what did I see earlier? The price of goods around the world, that's kind of what we apply it to, right? Like in the United States, a gallon of milk costs $2.50. In Mexico, it costs 5 pesos. I'm making numbers up, right? That's what we kind of use it to compare to eventually. But really, we're just comparing the price of one currency in terms of another. Okay, don't overthink things. Remember, our unemployment equation, all right, is pretty simple. We've got the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force. The tricky part is, okay, what a lot of people do is they're going to take the unemployed divided by the employed. That's not what we want to do, okay? Remember, the unemployed plus the employed is the labor force plus employed. Okay, that's the tricky part. They're asking you, they're having you remember that. Obviously, unemployed over number of employed. That's probably the most commonly way to miss this question. We've got to remember that the labor force is what we're looking at. Also, just as a quick review, remember the labor force, I can also be out of it, right? If I'm not looking for work or I don't have a job, I am out of the labor force. All right, a country's central bank to reduce unemployment. Okay, so how is the central bank going to reduce unemployment? All right, we're going to tie this in with a couple graphs real quick. Well, number one, right? We've got to be able to increase aggregate demand over here. And I got sloppy. I didn't label my axes. Okay, so we're increasing aggregate demand. Well, how do we do that? How do we get people to spend more money? Well, the central bank can only affect interest rates. So to get people to borrow money, the central bank in our supply of money graph here, right, they have to get this to move to the right. Okay, so remember, the central bank has three options to increase or decrease the money supply, and that is changing the reserve requirements. Okay, that is changing the discount rate or the federal funds rate, which is the amount of money that banks have to pay each other to borrow if they go below their reserve requirement, or they can sell securities or buy securities. Sorry. Remember, buying bonds makes the economy bigger. Buying is bigger. If they sell bonds, they're going to make the economy smaller. So if you can remember that buying bonds, that third option, okay, it's going to decrease the interest rate. Notice they try to trick you. Buy bond, or I'm sorry. No, they don't really try to trick you. They do up here. Sell bonds to decrease the interest rate. That's no good. They don't want to do that. Okay, so they do try to flip you there. Obviously, you've got to also know that increasing aggregate demand is going to reduce unemployment. So they did those things in there. Again, another tip. I see that idea of aggregate demand. I might want to try to draw that graph as quickly as possible to be able to tie myself or guide myself to figuring something out. All right, so next question here. This is a pretty tricky question, and I know that in class I didn't have too many that were halfway two steps like this. Okay, so we've got exports decreased by 10 mil, right? And we've got spending increased by 20 mil. So overall, we've got to make up, okay, a $10 million gap. Right? We've increased spending, we've increased GDP, right? GDP goes up potentially by 10 million. Okay, so there's kind of two steps to that because we've always done the problem. Well, the government's going to increase spending by 20 million. How much is that going to increase our output by? Right? And so it's asking us our GDP. What are we trying to increase it by? So we've got to know that we only get this 10 it's actually billions, okay? We only get this $10 billion value here because of the loss in exports, all right? Remember, we've got a couple things here that we also have to know. So the marginal propensity to, in this case, consume equals 0.75. That means we're going to spend 75% of our money on buying stuff. Marginal propensity to save, okay, is 0.25 because those have to equal 1, right? They have to equal 1 on the dot. Now, our spending multiplier, 1 over MP save, right, equals 1 over 0.25 equals 4. All right, so you've got to remember that. That's a little bit of a tricky thing to remember. I always like to think that and kind of try to remember that it's going to make it a round number. Okay, so you're going to have an even fraction here. So maybe one thing you can use is like if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, 1 over 0.75 is not going to give us a nice round number. Now, if it's 1 over 0.5, it is going to give us a nice round number. It's 1 over 0.5. You can kind of, you don't have to guess which one to use, right? But 1 over marginal propensity to save, 0.25, it's going to give us a nice round number of 4. Sometimes you can play around with numbers too, where, if you take that 1 divided by 0.75, you get kind of a weird number anyway, I would think. So you take that 10 billion, sorry, I miswrote, times 4, you should get $40 billion. Again, you're looking at the spending multiplier. Remember, the tax multiplier is the marginal propensity to consume over save. And so that lowers our multiplier by 1. We'll, I'm sure, get to that a problem like that in future review. Which of the following results? Federal Reserve sells bonds, make the economy smaller. Federal Reserve wants to make it smaller. We've got to increase interest rates. Again, increase interest rates. The way that we do that is we've got to move the supply to the left. Which one of those things happens when we sell those bonds, right? Smaller. Okay, become familiar with those. Obviously, we're kind of repeating ourselves a few different times here with these problems. A lot of them are extremely similar. All right, so current account deficit. I'm going to redraw this graph here because, again, I spin myself into circles. And if you've been in the classroom, you've kind of seen me do it. So I'm just going to have country A. I'm going to have country B. I've got my current account. I've got my finance account. All right. And I have my exports and imports, and I've got my outflows and inflows. All right. And so let me see if this gives us something a little bit more to start here. Which of the following is true for an account deficit? So remember, an account deficit means that I am importing more than my exporting. That's expensive for me. Okay, so I'm importing more than I'm exporting, and I can start filling these inequalities in. What I know is if I import more than I export, okay, is that the money that I send, in this case to country B, they can do two things. They can either spend it on country A's stuff. We know that they're not doing that. Otherwise, these would be equal signs. We already know that we have a deficit. Or I can obviously invest it in certain things, creating an inflow of money to the United States. All right, which if you look at option E here, it's financed by that surplus in the financial account. Okay, so anyway, just another way to kind of figure that out. One less thing to have to memorize if you know how to apply some of the stuff that we have talked about. All right, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, this is a deficit, which means that country B has a surplus, which means that we have a surplus for country A down a deficit. Okay, what has also been called positive inflows, negative inflows over here. So it's worded a couple different ways. Hopefully you're able to get enough practice on that to feel comfortable as we're continuing to move forward. Ooh, all right, we've got some type of unemployment here. The easy way to remember it, if I'm frictionally unemployed, that means I have friction with my financial situation, meaning that I need to either go make more money, I need to start making money, or I hate my job and I'm going to go find a new job. So friction with my situation. Okay, so again, I don't like the situation I'm in. In this case, I've graduated from college. Now I need to go start making money. I have friction needing to go start making money. Is our frictionally unemployed advantage. or I'm sorry, example. Cyclically, remember, that's business cycles, good and bad times. If I get laid off because of that, that means that my business went out of business. Structurally unemployed, that's if a structure replaces me. Think technology. Discouraged means I've given up. I can't be unemployed. He hasn't given up. Not in the labor force means that I am not looking for a job for whatever reason, which actually, as a review, discouraged workers are not in the labor force. Remember, to be looking for a job, I got to be putting in applications. All right, so we're talking here about we have an increase, we have a change in income, which what we're trying to do, okay, and we can check our work here. What we are trying to do is we want to promote economic growth, okay? So what we're trying to do in one way, shape, or form is we're trying to eventually do either this on our aggregate demand. All right. We could kind of say maybe keep in the back of our minds, we could think about like moving this with some technology stuff, but we should basically be able to eliminate that because nothing says about technology. It's asking us straight about taxes, and we know taxes can only affect our aggregate demand curve. So we're trying to move it to the right. All right. That's what we're trying to do. So how can we do that? Well, does income taxes decreasing, that gives us more money, that increases demand. Interest rates. We can decrease interest rates if we want people to borrow more money. That means it's also going to be a good example. Also, if we can promote investment, all right, spending, an increase in investment spending for whatever reason. Maybe it's a confidence thing. If I have confidence the economy is going to keep doing well, when businesses increase their investment, it increases the demand, it increases our GDP with that aggregate demand curve. So that's your best answer. Okay, so we're talking here, we've got kind of a two-stepper. We have the U.S. Central Bank is selling bonds on the open market. Okay, so let's kind of try to tie this in. Anytime the longer the question, the more I probably have to draw. So I've got the supply money, interest rate, quantity, and I'm making it smaller. So interest rates have gone up, okay? Now, I can also draw this on the loanable funds graph. It's going to come out to the same answer, but I now know that interest rates are going up. Well, it's asking me about what happens in the open market, okay? Or I'm sorry, in the foreign exchange market, okay? So in the foreign exchange market, here's kind of let me see if I have to draw Japan here in a second, but I'm sorry, is it U.S. versus Japan? It doesn't say anything. It doesn't necessarily say anything about it. So we can compare any country we want. So I'll just draw the US graph here simply because that seems like all we really need. So I've got the demand by, let's just call it Canada. Okay, so this is USA currency. We haven't had one of these. And so I've got Canadian dollar, US dollar, right? If I'm right here, it's 1 to 1. If I appreciate in value, then I can get 2 Canadian dollars with $1. If I depreciate, I can only get 1 Canadian dollar with 2 American dollars. And that's how I remember how to label this part of it up here. All right. Now, we have higher interest rates. It's going to mean two things. All right. We're talking about US, so let's kind of stay here and say, all right, since the US is having higher interest rates, that's going to lead some people to want to invest in US banks. All right. So that's going to increase our demand. That makes the value of the US dollar in this case go from here to here. That means appreciation. Right? You might have said, well, it also means that the US is going to invest in our own banks. This is one of those double shifters. And so they're going to demand less from other countries. So the US is going to supply less US dollars to other countries. The bottom line is we have an appreciation of the United States dollar. So we can say the value of the dollar is going to increase. Now, the problem with the value of the US dollar increasing is that means other countries can't afford our goods and services. So the problem with other countries not being able to afford our goods and services, that means that our exports are going to eventually decrease. All right. So That one's a little bit tougher. We talked about it most recently. There's a lot going into it, but that is the answer that you want based on, again, the interest rates that banks are able to charge people, or that people are able to get to invest in those banks. All right, last one here. If a country's balanced their budget and the government increases transfer payments, so that means the government's going to have to start borrowing money. Okay, so that means their budget's going to move into a deficit. I don't have to worry about interest rates in this case. The national debt is going to go up. If we're breaking even and we come up with, and again, notice they say we're not increasing taxes. If we increase transfer payments, we don't raise taxes, it's going to increase our deficit, move into, in this case, increase it, and our national debt will increase. Okay, that one's pretty common sense. Don't let yourself get wigged out when you see all these fancy terms that we've practiced a whole lot as we've gone through things. Hope that works out for you. Email me with questions. I'm happy to email. We can FaceTime or whatever, Google Meet, and I hope you're getting something out of these things. Almost to the end. Keep hanging in there. We're going to set you up for some success.